And our first speaker today is Dr. Joseph Barber. He's the Senior Associate Director at Penn Career Services, serving graduate students and postdocs. He's a PhD in animal behavior from the University of Oxford and has previously worked as a research fellow at Disney's Animal Kingdom, which sounds awesome and like a really awesome experience. And you're also currently also teaching graduate students as an adjunct professor at Hunter College. Dr. Barber enjoys thinking creatively to help people find and explore different career paths and is interested in hearing students and postdocs talk enthusiastically about their research. So keep that in mind when we get to our discussion time later. He'll be bopping between the smaller breakout rooms, and so you'll have an opportunity to share some of your experiences and get some more personalized assistance there as that comes up. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm glad you're inside in the cool and not outside in the, it's mostly all right, but it's a little bit humid out there. I am going to go ahead straight away and share my screen so we can make this a true resume party. So as you heard, I do serve graduate students and postdocs at Penn. And so primarily, a lot of my examples are focused on that population, but whether you're an undergraduate or a master's student or a PhD or a postdoc or beyond that, a lot of the information I'm sharing is going to be relevant for you as you think about your positioning your narratives for the next thing that you're doing. And the next thing you may be doing may be a postdoc, or it may be an industry role, or it may be a faculty role. And whilst it's hard to cover all of those in a lot of detail, what I'm going to sort of be encouraging you to be thinking about is how to position your skills, experience, and knowledge for whatever that role that is, right? So yes, there's a process involved, but you have to sort of think a little bit creatively and a little bit strategically about that in order to sort of make that work. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to think about resumes in general. Now, resumes would be the sort of style of document you would be applying for industry roles. I am going to touch on CVs sort of as part of the same discussion, and I'll sort of point out where there are differences. But again, it's really about the content of what you're trying to get across that is going to be important here. We'll take a look at some job descriptions and see how those can be the foundation for what you need to do. Formatting is important only so that no one ever notices your formatting, right? And so people spend a lot of time trying to make their formatting look great, but it's really there just to make the formatting disappear so people can focus in on the content. We'll talk about that. We'll touch on cover letters in a short sort of amount of time because they are a more individualized, customized document that is very specific to the role that you're applying to. And so there's less general advice that's there, but again, I'll talk about the strategy that you can use as you're thinking about that. And then obviously we'll have time for some questions. Most people know what a resume is. It's very confusing. Different countries talk about different things. In England, a resume is called a CV and a CV is called a CV. And so they're both CVs, but what's the difference? Many times you'll see that, organizations will ask for a CV or a resume and you'll be like, well, someone told me I don't need a resume for this, or someone told me I need a CV for this. And I would say that many people don't know quite sometimes what they're asking for. But we can, in a, let's say, a career advising appointment, we can talk about that. But in general terms, the resume is a far more exciting document than anyone's CV ever is. The CV is a sort of a long chronological list of pretty much everything that you've done. And, if you've been in the field for many years, it can be 10 pages long. And I can tell you that no one wants to read a 10-page document about sort of, lists of conferences that you've been to, because that's not a narrative. That's not what people read and go, oh, that's really exciting. So it's a sort of a point in time where you've been. The resume takes the things that you've done and transforms them into meaningful, relevant skills that are relevant to the role that you're applying to, that are relevant to the person who's reading it. They get that person excited about the potential that you bring and the value that you bring to the organization. And so there's much more of a process of really thinking about what it is that you bring, the value, the skills, the experience, and how to translate that into words that are meaningful to your audience. In most cases, for science-related roles in industry, your resume isn't going to be a one-page version because you may have a list of publications. You may need to list specific skill sets. You may need to go into research experience, and you're not going to be able to fit that onto one page. There's no magic with the one page. If you're going into consulting, maybe a one-page works. But in general terms, a 2 to 3 page resume that is sort of a hybrid between what you might have as an academic CV and what I'm talking about as a resume is probably going to be the best bet for industry roles. Different fields have different sort of preferences for these things, but at the end of the day, the content counts. The challenges that people have with resumes is this idea that you do have to customize your application materials for every job that you apply to. And this is the same for faculty jobs as it is for anything else. A CV can be tweaked subtly, less so than a resume, but you can customize. And it's hard sometimes if you've been focused on something for 5, 6, 7 years to think about that experience differently for a different type of role. And so the trick that sort of, the trap that people fall into is talking about what they've done in a way that doesn't resonate with your reader. And so these are the things that we'll talk about today. So at the heart of it, a resume is a sort of a more meaningful, let's say, business card type environment, right? The resume introduces you, your background. It shows the things that you've done in action, the skills and the experiences. And it also shows your accomplishments, the things that you've achieved, whether those are degrees, whether those are publications, whether those are collaborations. All of those are in the resume for people to see. The tricky part with a resume is that it has to communicate all this when you're not in the room to say, oh, let me tell you more about that. Oh, that's really interesting. Let me tell you this, right? So the resume has to stand alone based on what you write. And what you write has to mean just the same as what you hope it means to the person who's reading it, even though they don't have any of the context that you have, right? So this is the trick in terms of really trying to make sure your words are meaningful. If I were to ask you how to create an effective resume, probably the first thing that you would say is, well, you obviously need to sit down, you need to write it. And so the writing part of the resume is obviously important. If you don't write it, you won't have one. But it really is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going on. Because you can spend all day long playing around with a resume and tweaking a margin and changing a word and moving a bullet point from morning to sitting on the runway, and I don't know what that person's doing, to late at night, working on your resume, and it feels productive. You know, I've done something productive, I've been working on my resume. But really it's not effective, because if you're just talking about yourself from your own perspective, that's not going to be meaningful, excuse me, to the person moving forward. So whether you're thinking about consulting roles, or you think about industry roles, or you think about anything else, the strategy is to really spend more time connecting with people who can give you insights into the field that you're going into, be those academic insights or industry insights, so that you can take that knowledge and then use it to make your own narratives about your own experiences. So that the writing is not as critical, excuse me, as all these other aspects that go into making writing more effective and more easy. So that's research, career field research, and that's networking, engaging with people to understand who they are, how they do the things they do, what skills are valued. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, online industry research is something that you're doing all the time through these programs, through presentations that you go through conferences, through going to websites. So the American Chemical Society obviously has a wide range of sort of career field information that you've probably engaged with or probably seen, and it covers sort of different career field areas. It covers academia, government, industry, nonprofit, right? So there's lots of online stuff that you can just be reading to get a baseline knowledge. And you really need that, obviously, to understand what some of your options are, but to also understand how those things are different from one another. That's your solid foundation to do probably the most important part of resume writing, which will sound weird, but it's going to be the speaking with people who are in roles that you're really interested in, right? So whether that's a faculty role or an industry role, or even just a postdoc, having a conversation with someone who's already in it, who understands the nature of the job, who understands the skills that are relevant and that are valued, who understands the challenges that you might face. All of those conversations can help you decide how to talk about your skills in the best way possible. So there are many ways to network. You are a network within yourselves, right? Everyone who's in as part of this sort of group or this center you have your own networks, and other people will have other networks. And so by chatting with other people, you will find that you can make connections to a broader range of contexts that you don't yet know through someone that you do know who can introduce you to that person. So I'm going to take a very brief minute here to sort of talk about LinkedIn as a way to do research to help you write resumes. And I know, again, that it feels weird to sort of be focusing on networking to write a resume, but fundamentally, it's the most important, most valuable thing to do. And I'm going to do this from a pen perspective. So I'm going to jump over to my browser here. You should hopefully be seeing my LinkedIn profile here. I'm going to do this with pen, but everything I'm doing here, you can do for your own institutions, whether those are undergrad or your current ones or whatever that looks like. So on LinkedIn, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the University of Pennsylvania school page, right? So there are company pages, there are school pages, there are people pages. The school pages are great because they have along this line here an alumni tab. And the alumni tab groups together anyone on LinkedIn who says in their education section that they went to Penn in this case. Now, I'm not a Penn alum, so I'm accessing this as an outsider. I can access any institutions, academic institutions, alumni networks in the same way. So what I'm seeing here is that there are 185,000 alumni on Penn alumni on LinkedIn with profiles that I can search through. And this is broken down, this database of interactive database is broken down into 6 columns that are really helpful. Where they live geographically, which is often where they work or where they study. Where they work. Now, the University of Pennsylvania, these are probably a lot of students and postdocs in these roles as well. But you can see Google, Amazon, Facebook are the top employers right now. It's going to show me what they do, the roles that they play in their organization, right? So research, maybe something you're interested in. Engineering, maybe roles that sort of intersect with what you do as well. What they study is going to be important. We'll come back to that in a second. What they're skilled at, what they say they're skilled at, you can search on that, and how you're connected. So I can go here to what they studied, and I can click on, I can type in chemistry, and we'll do one more to sort of broaden our search. We'll go back, we'll do chemistry, chemical engineering, right? So we have 2 roles, 2 sort of broad career fields. Now, these don't match any particular institution's degrees or anything that's sort of broader career fields than that. So we have about 6,000 alumni from Penn who come from those fields, undergraduate, masters, PhDs, and so on. And you can see the organizations have changed now to reflect some of the roles that people go into. So Exxon and Dow are there, DuPont's there, some biopharma there. These are now organizations representing these 6,000 people. Now, what I can do also with these 6,000 people is I can type in a keyword that I want to search on, right? So separation, right? So now I've gone down from 6,000 to 139, which is sort of a nice manageable sort of group to be focusing on. And we can see the types of organizations that people who may be doing some of this, it could be in their background, it could be in their current role. These are the types of organizations that they work on right now. So 139, I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to see then those 139 people. It's going to show me their name, when they graduated, what they graduated in, their role at their organization, and also how I'm connected, right? So David Wallace, he's a VP at Environex, Recycle Technologies in Malvern, so local. I know 2 people who are my wife's schoolhood friends who know this person, right? So networks work in interesting ways. And if I was interested in knowing more about Environex or roles in this type of industry, and I wanted to sort of reach out to David, then obviously I could go through my mutual connections and say, hey, I see you're connected to David. I wonder if you could introduce me. So this is just an example of how to make these contacts. And I'll talk about exactly why you're making these contacts in just a second. So these secondary connections so valuable because you don't know them yet, but you know someone who does know them. And that's how introductions can work really effectively. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to get rid of our chemical separation here. The other keyword I'm going to use is a nice keyword because it really only reflects one industry, and that's professor, right? So if I were interested in faculty roles and I really wanted to do some research into what it's like to be a professor at different types of academic institutions, of which there are many, then I can find that there are 954 professors, assistant, associate, full-time professors that are Penn alumni with chemistry and chemical engineering backgrounds. And you can see the institutions that are out there. So again, if you are interested in knowing how to position your resume, your CV or your research statement or your teaching philosophy for different types of academic institutions represented by Penn alumni who are in your field working at those institutions, then reaching out and having a conversation can be eye-opening and enlightening about how you can do that. Let's do another keyword search. Let's go over here and do a skill search, and we'll do rare earths, right? One alum, right? So Jerome Robinson, assistant professor at Brown. We'll take a look at his profile. Another secondary connection, Mayan, I think was a PhD from Penn that I worked with previously. Jerome was at Penn, graduated in 2014, was an adjunct professor, was a research chemist at coatings, and another visiting, and then an assistant professor here at Brown. So again, a really great contact if you're interested in know the sort of the realities of working in academic environments, how Jerome navigated through those more temporary positions to get to the full-time position, right? Lots of background here that can be helpful as you're thinking about your materials. So with that, I'm going to jump back over to the presentation and then think about, well, why? What are we doing here? So in this slide here on the right, we talk about informational interviews, right? Informational interviews are a process where you reach out to someone who's doing the thing that you think you want to do to ask them more about how they do it and what they do and what that looks like and what that feels like. They are so valuable because as you're doing these information interviews, you can get insights into things that are really relevant from a CV and resume perspective. And one of those is skills, right? What are the skills in your current role that are so valuable to the role that you play, right? What are the things that you rely on to be effective in your role? And whatever they say when you're having these conversations, those are the types of things that you need to reflect on and say, well, have I talked about those in my materials? Have I highlighted, have I illustrated those things so that people can see that I also have those skills, or I can also overcome some of the common challenges that they face in these industry settings, working on multiple projects with tight deadlines. That's what they say is a key thing that they can do effectively. Have I demonstrated that? So these are just examples of questions. The guide that we have here for Penn that's freely accessible, so anyone can look at that informational interviewing guide. It really breaks it down into nice, easy ways for you to take a look at. From a resume perspective then, what this is going to give you is information on how you can translate your own experiences by using the words that you're hearing other people use, using those words to describe your experiences so that when you apply for a similar type of role, the hiring manager at the end of that process goes, oh, this person knows about this role. They know about our organization. They know what skills are valued, right? You're making their life easier by demonstrating that you know how to position your skills for that role. And that's so helpful because if, I don't know, 300 people apply for a job, the hiring manager doesn't want to have to try to interpret all those experiences that might come in. They really want the ones that say, I know that these skills are valuable. I know this is what you're going to be doing. So this networking will make your material writing so much easier, more pleasant, effective, joyous. And so I highly recommend taking this approach to do that. In talking about resumes, thinking about why you need to customize them as well, right? There are many reasons why it's important to spend some time making them different for each application, even in the same field, because, and I bulleted out here, the final audience is different. What they want is different. What the role is different. The size of the organization is different. The team looks different, right? And so as you understand more about an organization through your networking, through your research into them, you'll understand that there are different elements of your experience that you want to prioritize to make sure that those come to the forefront. So this is sort of more evidence as to why it's helpful. Now, the same is true with a CV, right? You can tweak a CV to prioritize different things because the faculty institutions that you may be applying to, the universities, are fundamentally different too. Research intensive, research and teaching, teaching intensive, state, local, private, whatever it is, right? So there are differences that you need to be aware of. Let's take a moment now then to jump in and think about the job descriptions that you often come across, because this is another way to really help make writing a resume really easy. First off, you really need to make sure you understand the terminology that you're reading, right? So these are just random bullets that I pulled from random jobs that have language that isn't commonly used in sort of probably your vocabulary. Matrix support from other staff. It's like, what on earth is that? Now, you could sort of ignore it and pretend it doesn't matter, but if you understand the term, you could probably identify skills that you do have that are relevant to this. Design decision matrix templates. Don't know what that is. Willingness to work in a cross-functional team environment. That's a very common one in industry. It usually means that you're working with different groups, different departments, with different functional areas and people with different backgrounds, but you need to understand what that looks like. It's a great question to ask if you're networking. This fourth one is a bit of a nightmare. Obviously, only works if you understand what on earth this field is, because I know nothing about what that says. And the last one I like, because as an animal behaviorist, I also have knowledge of pythons and pandas and maybe a bit of random forest, but probably not the right pythons and pandas and random forests that they're looking for. So again, making sure that you're translating what you're seeing based on their language and how they're using it, not based on the fact that you like pandas and pythons. So let's take a look at a couple of jobs that are that I pulled out that are sort of hopefully somewhat relevant to your field. Right? Senior environmental engineer scientist. This is a team supporting the DOE's Energy Technology Lab, focused on critical minerals, including rare earth elements. Right. So that's about the job. These were the only position responsibilities that they listed, which was very unusual for jobs. Usually they have lots of those, but these are the two that were listed. Provide technical, analytical, coordination support for conceptualization, formulation, implementation, management, program planning, outreach activities, cooperative programs, and all these other things. It's a bit of a mismatch in terms of how I understood it, but basically what I want to point out here is they are telling you the things that they need you to be doing, right? The highlighted terms here are the skills that they need you to have. And so as you think about your materials, if you're applying for this, this is how you want to frame some of your experiences. I've done things like this. I've used similar skills to that. Those are the responsibilities that they listed. Here are the requirements that they listed, which was a bit more robust to that. And again, I've highlighted some of the things that are important just to sort of, trigger your own sort of, oh, I should focus on that in my materials. An understanding of energy and environmental systems. Pretty much you all have that, but you need to demonstrate that. Professional experience related to extractive metallurgy of critical mineral, fossil plants, carbon utilization technologies, right? So this is a desired one. If you have it, you need to sort of verbalize that that's there. High degree of demonstrated intellectual analytical skills. So anytime you see the word demonstrated or proven in a job description, they kind of want a little bit more information than just saying, oh yes, I can do that. They want to see how you've done it. Now, this one's a very broad set of skill sets. You could say, well, look, I've got a PhD, surely that's enough. But you sort of need to sort of break that open and say, well, how have I used my intellectual skills in this context to be successful? Ability to work independently and structured in a team environment, right? So the language that you use can be helpful here. In a resume, you might say independently managed project as opposed to just managed project. You might say collaborated with a team of 3 people to complete a project, right? So you want to make sure that both of those skill sets are included somewhere in your experience section. Manage multiple tasks, effective communication. They talk about interacting with clients. Probably in some of your roles, you've never interacted with clients. So then you have to sort of break down, well, what does clients mean, right? Clients is just different stakeholders in this process. So where have I engaged with different people who are not researchers like me in a lab like mine, right? That's going to be a helpful demonstration. Results-oriented, multi-assignments, fast-paced, right? So this idea of completed 2 projects within a 6-month window, you're adding a sort of quantifiable element to the time span can be helpful to make that come alive. Here's a postdoc opportunity. Now, it's a postdoc in a national lab, so it's slightly different perhaps than a purely academic postdoc. And so this probably requires, well, it does require a sort of more of a CV approach, but it's also somewhat different from, there are elements here that are somewhat different, right? So at the bottom of this description, it says, the position will also comprise direct interface with colleagues, customers, and sponsors, right? So that's perhaps slightly more unique than an academic postdoc, a slightly different flavor to it there. But let's think about the job requirements. As you'll notice here, lots of demonstrated this, proven that. They really want to see these things come to life. Experimental background publication record. Having a list of publications is great. Including them as outcomes of the work that you've done is also great, right? So if I look at a list of publications, it's like, great. It's a visual signal that you've published. But if you also in an experience section say, collaborated with a team of 5 researchers that resulted in 2 publications, then those publications become evidence of how effective your collaboration with those team members were to achieve that, right? So you're going to list the publications to a certain extent twice. You're going to list them in the publications, but show them as outcomes of other skills in the experience section. You don't have to say what the publications were in the experience because that's covered in the list, but finding a way to demonstrate those is going to be a great way. Proven experience in handling of air-sensitive compounds. To a certain extent, if you've handled them, I guess you have proven experience. This one's a little weird in terms of their language. Actinized, transuranic materials, all these things. So these are just keywords. I said that wrong, I realize. These are all keywords that you want to make sure are echoed in your materials. If they mention the keyword, you mention the keyword. It's a great way of doing that. Proven self-motivation with a desire to be a technical leader. Now, it's sometimes hard to create a bullet point that says I'm a self-motivated person. So what you have to think about is, well, how can I show that I took the initiative, right? How can I say that I was the one who developed this new protocol, or I sort of reached out and established a new relationship that helped the lab doing the stuff. So initiating things is really a self-motivated and self-directed, right? So you want to find the language that aligns with that. A demonstrated record of innovative thinking. Innovative thinking is another keyword, right? So as you're talking about your research, you might use words like novel, develop novel protocol, created new approach to doing this, right? So that gets at the innovation. But what's also important here is that they say, as evidenced by publications, presentations, and letters of reference, right? And this is helpful because if you are reaching out to your references and saying, hey, would you write a reference for me for this postdoc? What you'd also want to say is, and also they're really interested in my technical excellence and innovative thinking. So if you could highlight elements of that in your letter, that would be wonderful. Now, they don't have to do that, and maybe they won't do that, but you need to help them understand that those are the things that are valued in terms of who's reading those letters. Team and independently, again, there's sort of both ends of the spectrum they want it, so you can give different examples of what that looks like, and then all these demonstrated things that you have to do. It's going to be important. Desired qualifications, so you don't have to have these, you don't have to have any of these qualifications, you just have to have around 70% of what they're looking for in general terms. But if you do have these are great. Obviously a broad background, so being very deep in one area is that's okay for that area, but if you can also demonstrate that you've intersected with other areas, that's going to be great. And that's what the next one says, ability to sort of apply different concepts in different settings, right? So where have you switched between fields or use the same technique in different areas or use different techniques in the same area? Where have you done that? And then a whole bunch of letters that mean nothing to me, but obviously mean a lot to you. So making sure that you list those is going to be important as part of that process. At the end of this one, they did say, make sure you write a cover letter. And they also said only complete applications with a cover letter and CV will be considered. So that's why it's important to always give them what they want. And here they've told you exactly the sections that they want, which is very nice when they give you sort of nice directions there. You can add more to that, but they're saying at minimum include these. So again, follow the instructions, right? Don't go all crazy and say, well, here's a resume with totally different things. Make sure that you're sort of following the information that you're given. Okay, let's think about then your own materials, right? So we're going to cover some sort of formatting and content as part of this. Generally speaking, whether it's a CV or a resume, you want to make your sell, your pitch, that you are the right person to be interviewed. This gets you the interview, not the job. You're the right person to be interviewed in the first page, and ideally in the first half of the first page, right? People's attention spans are very short, so making sure that you're front-loading your materials with the most relevant experiences is going to be important. Many times in a resume, you might start off with a summary of qualifications that pulls from different sections. If let's say you have a 3-page resume, the summary can do a great job of making sure that everything that's important from those 3 pages is summarized right at the top of the first page. It's like the conclusions of a paper, right? You're going to list these first so that people get excited to read the actual paper because they're like, well, I want to know more. But just like the conclusions of a paper, you can't say things in the summary section that aren't echoed by things that are more detailed in the experience section. So those specific experience tier up to those summary sections. And we'll talk about some examples of that a little later on. Skills are great. You can list those skills, especially techniques and technologies and lots of those initial things that you can list. But as those things become important to the role, you also want to demonstrate those in action, right? So you could list Microsoft Office because they might list Office, but no one really wants to know that you can use that. But some high-level program, technology that you're using, you want to make sure that they can see it in action in your experience section as well. Your name, obviously, you're at the top. You want to keep it very simple. No one really needs your street address anymore. No one's going to write to you. So just your city and state is probably fine. It keeps it streamlined. 1 email, 1 phone. You can throw your LinkedIn in there. Just make sure your LinkedIn matches what you're saying in your materials more or less, so it's not a disconnect. If you do use your LinkedIn, then do make sure you customize your LinkedIn URL, right? This is the thing that you share that takes you to your profile. If you haven't gone into your settings and customized it, it is covered by random numbers and letters at the end. If you customize it, you can make it your name. If no one else has your name, mine's Joseph Barber, PhD, because there are lots of Joseph Barbers, but perhaps I'm the only one with a PhD, which is not true, but I was the only one who chose that on LinkedIn. Education section, again, this is going to be fairly tight in both of your sections. If it's a CV, you might list your PIs or your advisors, your thesis committee. But in general terms, you want to spend most of your time talking about your education as an experience. And we'll get to that in a second. Relevant courses can be great as keywords. So make sure that you're including those. Expected graduation dates are good because that way the person reading it knows when you're going to be free to start the role. But if you say, 2018 to present, they don't know how long you're going to be. Many people then in resumes often have a work experience section. Work experience doesn't sound like a great term anyway. It's like work. Work is a sort of a non-positive word. But I think what happens is people get confused and think about work as in, well, these are the things that I'm paid to do, right? As a student, hopefully you're paid, but you may be paying money to be a student, right? And so oftentimes people don't list students as work experience because it's not paid. What that means is that sometimes I see a resume for an industry role and the first experience is a teaching assistant role at Penn, where these are the bullet points that they talk about. Well, I graded exams and held office hours. That's what you were paid to do. But obviously, those experiences are not helpful for a research role, a R&D role in industry, right? So putting those right at the front of your resume is not going to be a great selling point. Now, suddenly you can make a better version of this. Well, I held office hours with 40 students and 400 papers, right? So I can work to deadlines. So you can quantify things and make them stand out. You can talk, about subject expertise, like grading papers on rare earth element extraction. So I have that knowledge, but still the teaching assistant role isn't the role you're trying to sell, right? You as a student, as a postdoc, as a researcher, those are the skills in many cases that are going to be most valuable. So rather than work experience, what I often recommend would be a research experience for a research role, or even just a broader relevant experience that might put in different experiences that have relevant skills, experiences for the role that you're applying to. So being a master's student or being a PhD student or being a postdoc, these would be under the experience section where you can make that experience come to life for the reader. When writing that experience section, you really want to make sure that you're creating dynamic mini stories about your skills in action. So the sort of general formula is skill, context, outcome. I use this skill that's relevant to my reader in this context that's hopefully still relevant to my reader that achieved this goal. And the outcome is what demonstrates how effective your skill is. Led a team of 5 people that resulted in first place prize on this competition. The first place prize demonstrates my leadership was effective. But if I just had led a team, then obviously that doesn't demonstrate how effective a leader I am. So these are the sort of structures that you want to use. Now, in a CV, you should still have bullets under your research experience. You may have research experience and teaching experience in separate sections. Bullets are still going to demonstrate how you've done your science, and that's going to be important for people to see. Now, I talked about using the job description as a sort of foundation for the resume, and I think sort of sometimes people take that too much to heart, and so you sort of read these broad categories that we saw in the job descriptions that we went through, and then I look at resumes where people have just said, well, I do that. I am a good communicator. I have overcome strategies. And the challenge with the sort of that type of approach is, as you try to imagine what that person actually did, if you read these as bullet points as a hiring manager, there's nothing that you can picture in your mind. There's no image, there's no vision, there's nothing that you can sort of say, oh, that's great. And without that image, it's hard for a hiring manager to sort of superimpose your image onto the role that they're trying to fill, right? So these aren't strong enough descriptions to make someone remember who you are. They're not specific enough to you to make that meaningful to the reader. And I'm going to go back to this idea again, that the employer only has the words that you're giving them to sort of understand what's going on. So obviously, instead of those broad categories, you'd make it meaningful to you, and it would be different for you than anyone else in this group right now, because you have a unique approach to these experiences. So it would be specific to you, which would be great. So these are just examples of taking those broad categories and making them more meaningful. So collaborating with 3 chemical engineers and physical chemists, 2 international labs to coordinate detailed project update meetings, ensuring strict adherence to research protocols, right? So I've quantified it. I've got an outcome here. I've sort of provided context, chemical engineers and a physical chemist, right? So I can work with different people if I'm not one of those people. Overcame roadblocks. I identified inconsistent humidity levels in the lab that was a confounding variable and advocated for a change that enabled projects to move forward, not just mine, but other people, right? So there's a problem solving here. There's advocating, there's speaking up for others and being supportive in the lab. And there's an outcome that sort of is beneficial. Independently managed 2 concurrent research projects, collaborated with a team of 4 researchers in the last 12 months, resulting in 1 first author and 1 co-author paper. So again, this is sort of quantifying across a time scale productivity, right? So not only sort of numbers here, but there's a time element to it that you can make come to life. Now, it's easy for me to write stuff because I'm just making it up. Obviously, you have to make it relevant to your experience. And this is where sometimes chatting with people in this group, with your peers, with your network, with your mentors, with advisors, at your institutions can be so helpful to sort of brainstorm different ways of approaching that. The other thing with bullet points is that they're sort of structured in a priority order. Like the first skill that you give me is the thing that you're trying to really sell me on. Manage team, in this case, collaborated with 4 students, right? So as I scan down a resume, and most people scan down sort of vertically, they don't necessarily read everything, they're sort of doing a quick scan. It's great here that I can see that you collaborated with 4 students from 3 academic disciplines. I can do a little bit of a verbal origami here and flip this around and say the same thing, but in a different order. I use Python to develop an algorithm to scrape data on climate from government databases as part of a 4-person team, right? So it's still a 4-person team and I'm still collaborating, but this time I'm prioritizing the programming language or the technical aspects that I want people to see, right? So I flipped it around. And again, use knowledge of federal agencies to identify key climate change data. So it's the same experience, but flipped again. So what that means for you is as you look at a job description, you have to decide what skills they value the most and make sure that you are reorienting your bullet points to make sure that those come to the forefront, right? You really don't want to bury the things that they care about the most at the end of a bullet point. You want those to be at the forefront so people can really see those. Things to avoid when talking about your own experiences. I'll be sort of not so exciting words. I assisted, I participated, I worked. Yeah, again, work. What are you doing today? I'm working. Right? Working is a terrible word. You want to get rid of work. Responsible for doesn't mean that you did it. It means that you were meant to have done it. So if you say responsible for managing this thing, it sort of creates some doubt in the mind of the reader that you actually did it. But if you said did this thing, then obviously I know that you did it. Duties include, oftentimes people talk about, and duties, again, sounds like a terrible word. It's like, well, I had to do it. I didn't want to do it. So make it far more engaging as I'm thinking about that. So, assisted, if you say I assisted, I don't really know how you assisted, right? Maybe you made the coffee and everyone else did the research. Maybe who knows? So make sure you talk about how you assisted, right? I assisted this project by completing the literature review and sharing findings with the primary research contact. That's what you did. That's a transferable skill right there. People often talk about conferences, right? You have a whole list of conferences sometimes in CVs, and that's great, but usually when I pick out, oh, you went to Miami, oh, you went to Denver, right? There's nothing that really sort of jumps out as being exceptionally helpful, but you can make the most of any conferences that you attended, even if you didn't present, to demonstrate that you are engaged in a network, that you've sought out information, that you took the initiative to learn something new, going back to this idea of being self-motivated that we talked about last time. So again, very different ways of describing something in a much more engaging manner. I talked earlier about these conclusions, the summary statement that can be a great way of setting the stage for how you want the reader to understand who you are, right? So these are the themes that then make everything that you say below make sense. And let me give you an example of how those can look in sort of the real world, right? So broad themes that must be relevant to the role that you're applying to. Because if you obviously start off with a conclusion that's not relevant to the role that you're applying to, then that's a disconnect that's going to sort of set the wrong stage where you want to set the right stage. Extensive knowledge and cutting-edge research experience in rare earth element separations, right? So that might have come from 3 different positions that you've had, but you want them to know that you have that information. So that's one theme. Skilled in overcoming research challenges with innovative research approaches, right? It's a little bit general. I might look for ways to sort of make that slightly more contextualized, but then what I'd be looking for in the rest of the document, if I read that, is illustrations of what that's looked like. Effective collaborator across disciplines, building strong relationships and generating publications with researchers in chemical engineering, biotechnology, and physics. So again, collaborations, working interdisciplinarily in these work. That's going to be a theme that pulls from different experiences. And then this last one is a little bit of a personal one, right? Enthusiastic and passionate about novel research, sustaining these things, right? That gives me a little bit of energy about you. And I think sometimes a resume, and especially the CV, they can lack energy and they can be hard to read. So if you inject a little bit of that, that's going to be helpful. This is where the cover letter will come into play in just a second. So hopefully these give you an example of how you might structure that summary statement up front so that the rest of your resume then becomes far more engaging and meaningful to the reader. Things to avoid. If you use all caps as your headers, oftentimes Word doesn't check those because there's a setting that you can select. People spell professional experiences in so many different ways because when you proofread it, you'll never look at your titles, right? Because your brain just skips over those. Assess versus arses is a common word that I often see, and obviously you don't want to be the person who has arses in their resume unless that's what you're studying. So making sure that, it's maybe the wrong word, but using the right word correct effectively there. Being consistent with your formatting so that no one ever notices. I'm going back to this idea that it doesn't really matter what hyphen you use between the dates throughout your materials, but if you use 17 different versions of hyphens, it demonstrates a sort of a lack of attention to detail. And if I notice that, and I always notice it, I don't know who else notices it. If I notice it, I'm like, well, this is 2 pages that you are trying to showcase you at your best. And yet, this doesn't quite look so great. So just go through and be consistent throughout so that no one has any opportunity to go, oh, how terrible, hyphens. Spacing is going to be important because it's hard to read something that's so crowded and so dense because you try to squeeze so much onto one page that there's no space to breathe, right? It's the difference between walking through a mosquito leech-filled swamp and an airy tree-lined avenue with a soft summer breeze cooling you down. Which one do you want to be on? You want to be on the one on the right. So make sure that your materials sort of reflect that aeration of your materials. You need people to be able to absorb that information by taking a breath as they're reading, as it were. So this is just examples of things sitting on top of each other. Sometimes with CVs, people spread them out. So it's on 5 pages when really needs to be on 2 pages. Spreading out just makes it harder for people to see all your experiences together. So find a nice sort of consistent set of formatting here where within sections, you're fairly tight. Between sections, there's a little bit more space. So it's easy to navigate those through there. Again, this is sort of some of the psychology of helping the hiring manager feel good about you, even though it doesn't really change what you're saying. Punctuation, another easy one to fix, right? So you just want to make sure that you're consistent. You don't have to have it, or you can have it. It's really up to you, but just spend 2 minutes to make sure that it's all consistent. I know not all of you necessarily are Penn students or alumni, but you can access many of our materials about resumes and cover letters free on our website, as you can, and pretty much any academic institution if you scroll around long enough. So do take advantage of the resources that we might have there as you're thinking about these materials. The other thing I'm going to pitch for you to do, and this is especially for those who are at Penn, is to make sure that you have connected with career advisors or internal within this group here, do peer-to-peer reviews of your own materials, because it's actually much easier to give people critical feedback on their materials than it is to give critical feedback on your own materials. And so by practicing doing that nicely to other people, you'll learn to do that better with your own materials. The reason it's so important, because your brain is fundamentally so great that it makes your life more difficult than it needs to be, right? Because if you can understand anything I've written in this top half, imagine what your brain does when it looks at your resume for the 400th time. It's like, yeah, it's fine. Like, I don't want to read this anymore. It's boring. Just send it off, right? Your brain is going to say it's perfectly fine. Your brain's going to look at your materials and going to say, yeah, you've definitely demonstrated those skills. Whereas when I read it for the first time, and those words don't tell me those things, I don't see it, right? Your brain fills in the gaps, as it's doing here. And so make sure getting a third person to look at it is going to be important. Let's jump into the cover letters just quickly, because I want to make sure we have time to cover the cover letters, obviously. Here's a post I pulled from LinkedIn a while back, but I think it was a nice representation of the sort of the power or the drawback of doing cover letters badly, right? So I'll give you a time just to read this while I take a sip of water. So basically, this person is sort of angered by general cover letters that say nothing. After reviewing your job, it's clear that you're looking for a candidate that's extremely familiar with the responsibilities and can perform them confidently. Given these requirements, I'm certain that I have the necessary skills to do the job adeptly and perform above expectations. Just like those general bullet points that we talked about earlier, if I try to picture what you are or who you are or what you bring, there's no imagery at all, right? It's nothing about you. It's just words, and people don't remember random words, right? They remember stories, they remember examples. And so that's what we're going to focus on as part of this. Cover letters are why documents. Why are your experiences a good fit for this role? Why on earth do you want this role? Why do you want to work for our company, right? So these are some of the questions that you have to ask and answer in a cover letter that aren't really addressed directly in the resume, because the resume is all about the skills. The other difference with cover letters is that they're narrative documents, right? You get to use paragraphs and can piece together more than one sentence and make it meaningful. And so it's an opportunity to tell stories and to make those stories meaningful to your reader. And by telling stories, I mean, if you think about what a story is a small piece of tension or drama that's resolved by something, right? And so this idea of creating a story that demonstrates how you overcame a thing, or how you innovated to break through an obstacle, a barrier in terms of the research. These are great stories to have because they sort of have an element of drama and tension about them that holds the reader's attention. They're also more personal documents in that you can be a little bit more, you can share more of your inner perspectives, right? You can talk about what excites you, what you're passionate about. You can talk about what you took away from an experience, right? Those inner thoughts don't come across in the resume, but they do come across or can come across in a cover letter. As a general structure, this is what I recommend when I talk about cover letters. So pretty much any field, a one-page cover letter is usually going to be enough, even with academic roles. But in academia, they're asking for 17,000 documents anyway. So if it goes to 2 pages, that's probably fine. It's not going to add too much. But industry, a nice one-page cover letter is going to be great. First paragraph tells them what you're doing. I'm applying for a role. And then you summarize, very much like the top of the resume, what it is that you bring to that role so that there's an excuse for the reader to continue reading the letter, right? So it really showcases upfront that you understand the role and you have those experiences. The middle paragraphs then become you saying, I've gained these experiences from these settings, I've enjoyed doing this, and I'm very competent in these types of environments, for example. And then you take a small slice of one project or one experience, and you tell a story about it that is a little bit more meaningful to the reader. Those are, I'll sort of give an example of that in a second, but those are sort of the main part of the letter. The last paragraph then becomes why this job, why do you want this job, why are you applying for this job, and why this company? So the first 2/3 of this letter is about what you bring to the role. The last third or the last quarter is really about what you want from the role and how the role and your goals intersect. What you don't want to do is start the first paragraph by saying, I'm really excited about this role because it's going to give me lots of opportunities to grow as a professional. Because they don't know who you are. They may not want you to grow as a professional if they don't know who you are. And so selling what you want first is the wrong way to do it. Sell what you bring, get them excited about that. And then at the end, you can say, and I'm really excited to work at this organization because. So if you think about these middle paragraphs, then in a resume, you might say, collaborated with 3 researchers to do an analysis of metal separation that resulted in 2 publications, right? That's a skill, it's an outcome, it's perfectly great, but it's not really a story. in a cover letter, you might say, when I was working on the collaboration to separate this metal from the, using this process, one of the challenges of this particular project is that no one had done this before. And so what I had to do is I had to reach out and establish a relationship with two researchers from another lab and integrate some of their new research into protocols that we were using at the lab that are now used by 15 members of the lab and have resulted in a publication. So it's a small sort of slice of the story, but it gives more examples of how you approach things. There was a problem, you reached out to your network, you made it work, it had a great outcome. And so those stories can have that emotional element of, one of my most exciting projects was this, or what I really enjoyed about that experience was getting to build my network and solving a problem at the same time, right? I'm satisfied, I enjoy, I'm excited. You can't say that in a resume, excitedly collaborated with two people, right? That's a weird bullet point to write, but in the cover letter, you can own that sort of emotional state. And it doesn't have to be super emotional, it just has to have energy about it so that people are excited by that process. We talked about networking earlier and how that's going to help inform some of your narratives when you apply for things. It's also a great thing to include in this last paragraph. So if you've reached out to someone who works at a company that you are applying to, you can say in this last paragraph, I really, I've spoken to several people who work at your company, and I've really enjoyed hearing about the new mentoring program that you have for young researchers. I've always valued mentoring in my previous roles, and so I'm excited about bringing my skills and getting to have this experience. What that demonstrates is that you've been proactive. You've reached out to people ahead of time. You've been thoughtful. You've had professional conversations. You've listened to what they've said, and you have a true, authentic reason why you're excited about working for that company. And that's going to make the reader really excited to sort of think, oh, I could picture this person here because they want to be here, because they've already invested time in learning about us and the people that are at this organization. Oftentimes, this is the type of first paragraph that I see in first draft cover letters. I'm writing to express my interest, staff scientist role. I'm a coach to PhD student. I graduated in 2016 with my bachelor's. I believe that my combination of research and business skills will be a great fit for this role and will allow me to further develop my professional career. Express my interest is not really what you're doing. Really what you're doing is apply. So I just say I'm applying for the position. It's much more direct. I believe that my combination, right? Any belief statements need to be preceded by something that that allows me to share that belief, right? Right now, if this is the first thing that I've read, how can I believe that your research and skills would make you a valuable fit? Because I know nothing about you. But if you can say, with 3 years experience doing X and Y and knowledge of X, I believe that my experience is a good fit, then obviously I'm going to believe in that too, because there's more evidence. This role will allow me to further develop my professional career, right? Allow me is not great words anyway, but this is about what you want right away, as opposed to what you can bring to them. And that's what I would prioritize. So let's switch it around a bit, right? I'm writing to apply for the staff scientist position with 4 years of experience coordinating multidisciplinary research on rare earth elements as a PhD at Penn, using innovative chemical processing techniques, success in problem-solving research obstacles that have laid multiple projects, and an interest in being on the cutting edge of this thing. I'm excited to bring my passion for product development to this role at this organization. Now, this is too long. This is me putting together words that I don't use a lot, as you can probably see, but gives you an example of how you're front-loading the things that are valuable. Now, these themes that you're touching on here, these are the things that you want to illustrate in action in the main paragraphs when you start telling stories about that. But a much more dynamic paragraph that really sets the reader up to go, oh, great, this is very exciting. This last paragraph then, we'll spend just a little bit of time on this one. Again, if you know about the projects that they're working on because you've done networking, you've spoken to people, you can say, I'm really excited that your organization is working on X, right? Again, that demonstrates knowledge of the organization. If you've met them, if you have gone to a recruiting event like a career fair and you've engaged with someone, you can also talk to them there. I enjoyed speaking with one of your representatives at the recent career fair. Ideally, if you've made connections and you mention these people by name, the hiring manager can reach out to that person and say, hey, this person is applying. What do you know about them? They're like, oh, I had a great conversation. They seem like they're a great person. And that person then becomes an advocate for you, maybe even an unconscious advocate for you by saying, yeah, I had a great time chatting with them. So the more you're doing this networking, the more you can sort of tie that into your materials, the better off you'll be. Oh my goodness, 11:47, and we're mostly on time, but that's the quick run through of all the things, not all the things. That's an overview, very thin overview of some of this process that might be important to you as you're thinking about the roles that you have. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I know I covered it at top speed. It's, what is it, Thursday, Friday morning, so it's pretty good to do that. It's Wednesday probably. But I'm happy to take any questions that you have. I'm pointing to other resources that might be available to you, but I encourage you to really think about these documents, especially the resumes, as a creative way of aligning your skills, interests, and values with those of the organizations that you're applying to. In order to do that effectively, you have to understand those organizations, which means you have to research them and connect with people in them in different ways. And that type of networking can be just as effective whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. Sometimes you just need to get started, and you'll see that it's actually really helpful and engaging way of doing that. Much better than sitting in your bedroom or on a runway writing a resume for the 1000th time, which is not engaging at all. Any questions? Or however you want to do this, Marta. I'm going to pass it back to you.
If anybody would like to ask a question, you're welcome to unmute. You're welcome to put it in the chat if you don't want to put yourself, out there, and I'm happy to read them that way too. Either way, thank you so much. This is a really great presentation. I'm actually going to commandeer for just a moment because I'm actually curious about something, and I think it's relevant to situations that might come up, at least from my experiences. Do you have advice on how to address in a cover letter skills that maybe are asked for, but you don't necessarily have them officially, but you've sort of done it tangentially before? And a lot of times this came up in a conversation yesterday. There's these main projects and then there's these side projects that folks are engaged in, and they may spend all their time in their resume talking about the main thing, but it's actually the side thing that's actually more relevant to that job. So I just wondered if you had advice on that.
Right. So, I mean, there's different ways of approaching it, right? So even if you have been associated with a knowledge area, let's say you're working in a lab and the other groups are working on this and you've been peering over their shoulders and going, oh, that's really interesting. Even in a resume, you might say, gain knowledge of this technique through exposure with colleagues in the lab, right? It's not really a skill, but it says, look, I have a baseline. This is something valuable that's out there. So that's one way of approaching it. In terms of the side projects, I mean, this is where sort of that relevant experience section becomes so helpful, because it's not just it's not everything that you've done. It's really the most relevant stuff. And obviously the academic stuff is going to be relevant at some point. But let's say, just because it's easy for me to give an example, let's say you were part of the Penn data science group, and that data science experience where you volunteered on a project was really relevant to the role that you're going into. You don't have to start the relevant experience with PhD student at Penn. You could start with member, Penn Data Science Group, and then talk about those experiences that you had there, because prioritizing those for the reader is more important than following, well, I'm currently a PhD student, that's what I'm doing right now. So you still have to follow a mostly chronological order or reverse chronological order, otherwise it just makes it difficult for people to navigate through, but you can decide what to slot in first. Now, let's say it wasn't part of a student group, maybe it was an independent thing that you did. I mean, you could define yourself any way you liked. You could be an independent researcher, if that's the title that you want to give yourself, and then you just have to actionify, action something, make that experience, I can't think of the word, put it into action so that people can see it in different bullet points. But it's just as valuable as things that you're paid to do and things that you are there to do, right? Just because it's a separate experience doesn't mean that you can't prioritize it, because again, you're looking at it from the reader's perspective. What do they need to know? What do they need to see first to get excited by it? Does that sort of answer that question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. All right, so questions. If you want to unmute, go ahead. If you want to put it in the chat, have at it.
I'll ask a question, Joseph.
Sure.
As someone who on some occasions reads resumes and CVs for different purposes, I was interested in the comment you made about injecting energy into the language of the documents. And I wonder if that can be overdone. I mean, sometimes I feel like, there's too much energy and it generates fatigue for me if I'm reading this. So I feel like, I mean, the editing process is an important part of this. And I guess the point is getting feedback about, energetic language, or if you're, just starting out and preparing the first professional resume where you're sending it out, getting feedback about it is really important. So you don't overdo something like this. I don't know if you have any comment about that.
Right. So I mean, a lot of it is matching language to the audience, right? So if in a job description they say we're looking for someone who's passionate about X, or they're looking for someone who, when I applied for the job at Penn, and the last bullet point was a good sense of humor. I was like, what do I do? Tell jokes? But those are things that you just want to reflect on. Those are also things that you can ask about when you're doing the networking, right? To someone to say, what is the culture of this organization? What type of, what does your day look like? What does that energy feel like in the room, right? It's a question that you can certainly ask. For some roles, though, I think it's important, right? So let's say you are applying for a non-profit role where you may be paid less in an industry. What they need to know that you are is passionate about the topic, because they can't give you $100,000 more, but they can give you the opportunity to make your passion come to life. And so I think that energy needs to, be reflected in that thing. In a research lab, we're running around excitedly holding rare metals and, corrosive chemicals is not a great idea. Then obviously thinking about, what that energy actually looks like. The energy there might be a curiosity, right? I'm really curious about these different areas. My research has, intersected with all these different areas. I've taken advantage to have these new collaborations that I've established, right? That is still energy, but it's sort of that energy of initiating and creating and being self-directed as opposed to just being told what to do. So I mean, all your points are valid, and they're incredibly valid, because at the end of the day, whoever reads it brings their own perspective to whatever they're looking at, right? And no one can control who's reading it. And the person who's reading any of your resumes might have a terrible resume. I might be judging your resume based on their resume, not on what I think is a good resume. So there's a little bit of sort of, it's a bit opaque, right? You can't really see that. But that's why I think the matching of the content and the language and the skills, you can never go wrong with that if you really articulated what you bring to the role. The energy aside, I mean, some people have a natural energy, some people are overtly energetic, some people are not. I mean, I'm not trying to say that you need to be anything that you're not, but having read many cover letters, the ones that do sound like the example that I shared, from that LinkedIn post, that it's like, I'm glad I got through it, because it did nothing to me except for, hold up space in my brain unnecessarily. And so that I think is what you're trying to fix, is not to make the reader go, oh, well, that was a waste of my time, right? So even if you learn something about you that is unique, that can be sometimes helpful.
Alex, go ahead.
All right, thanks. That was super valuable overall. I've heard of people putting like kind of like even a hobbies section on a resume before, to add like a human element to the stack, I guess. And I guess I was wondering what your take is on that kind of thing.
So certainly it's something that my colleagues who work with undergraduate students tend to sort of see a lot, and they don't have any issues with that. I think the sort of the extracurricular experiences can demonstrate lots of different things. I mean, I've certainly seen hobbies that are like reading and watching TV, right? And it's like, well, you and everyone else, in this entire universe. So it's not necessarily unique by itself there. If you are applying for a consulting role, and I'll use this as an example, the types of interests that they want you to have there should be reflectant about what they would like to see in an ideal candidate, right? So you might say, well, I have an interest in rock climbing, and that's perfectly fine. For a consulting firm, maybe they would like to see something more like, successfully climbed 5 of the world's tallest mountains, right? Because that's the type of personality that they say that they want. Whether they need that is, debatable. So think about why you want to tell people about your hobbies, right? So I had someone who said that they were an Eagle Scout as part of their interests. But I'm like, well, that was a long time ago. And they said, but the last interview I had, the person there was also an Eagle Scout, and we had a great conversation. It seemed like we created a moment there. And so I'm not going to say that it's really not valuable at all, but certain hobbies are less important or less interesting or less conversationable if you put them there. So I would say, generally speaking, you don't need them, unless you really want to include them because you have evidence to suggest that including them would be helpful, right? And that comes from the culture of the organization sometimes.
Thanks.
Excellent. Amit, would you like to go?
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Thank you, Joseph, for such a nice talk. It's very different from many other similar talks I've attended. I have a question related to the publication section for industry job, and there is a very big misconception among people that when you're applying for industry jobs, publications don't really matter, which I really don't like that opinion from people. But also, if you look up different examples of resumes, usually for industrial job resumes, the technical skill section is on the top and publication section is really hiding at the bottom. I just wanted your opinion on that particular.
Yeah, so good observations, and I think it demonstrates the flexibility of the tool and of the document or the as the material that you can prioritize different things, right? So for some roles, if you don't have the technical skills, you can't do the job, right? So making sure that the first thing that people see is, look, I can do the things, the technical skills are important, gets it out of the way and allows then people to focus on the ways that you've used those skills to be successful. So front loading the, under your education, if that's where you are right now as your first section, having your skills there, is perfectly fine when done strategically, right? To make sure that those are prioritized. Publications by themselves, are great outcomes there. And I would say in industry, there's different reasons why they are more or less valuable, right? They are definitely valuable because they demonstrate that you've been successful and productive as a researcher, right? You've done something and it's resulted in this thing, and you need those skill sets for an industry role. In some industry roles, you will never publish again, potentially, because what you are working on can't be published in the same way or isn't published in the same way. So they also need to know that publications aren't a thing that you may be doing moving forward. For some industry roles, that is valuable and they do publish, right? So there's a difference there. But I think the publications are always valuable because they demonstrate that you've been successful in your field, you've made progress, you've done it collaboratively in many ways. But they take up a lot of space depending on how many you have. And sometimes too many lists up front, here's my list of skills and here's my list of publications, makes it a very dry read when you're reading through it because the reader's like, well, yes, but who are you and what does that look like? So certainly, I think if you can integrate those publications into the experience section by mentioning them, you can have a bullet point that is published 5 papers, including 2 first author papers. You can summarize that publication section as a bullet point and then also include the list. That to me is a nice way of balancing it. So the list is there, but you're also not, having to wait to page 2 or 3 to see that as outcomes of your work.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Cooper, I think you were next.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. That was a really great talk. A particular question that I've had when formatting my resume is when I should start dropping some of the extracurricular activities from my undergrad, because the spacing between your undergraduate degree and graduating from a PhD program, that's about 9 years or so, or even more of time. And I think that a lot of the activities from my undergrad are relevant. However, I don't think I should be including as many of them in my resume. And I don't necessarily know if people want to hear them as much now that I've been at Penn all this time. So I was wondering what you think would be good, whether it be like moving some of the extracurricular activities that are relevant into different buckets and just putting a timestamp instead of labeling the institution as like the undergraduate institution, or if you know of any way people have circumvented that problem in the past.
Well, it's never a problem to have experiences, right? So it's what to do with the experiences that's the question. So to a certain extent, the version that you're selling right now for the jobs that you may be applying to, whatever those might be, needs to be present time you, right? And so the things that they are going to value are the things that you bring with them, probably from a research setting that you've done over the last few years. Those extracurricular activities add value to your fundamental experience that you have right now because they demonstrate skills that you may not have had in the lab setting, for example. They may be leadership skills or being able to work with diverse populations or communication skills. But you need to be strategic about what skills you're trying to add to the main narrative that you're creating. So generally speaking, what I would have is a relevant for a resume, a relevant experience section that pulls things that are directly relevant to the role that you're applying to. So that would be in industry, it would be research, it would be market research for a consulting club or whatever that might be, lots of different things that might be relevant to industry. Those other experiences I might frame as leadership experiences from one perspective, because I think leadership is a broad enough category to include that. And industry loves people, just like consulting firms do, industry loves people who have a goal to be leaders in their field, be technical leaders, be leaders, mentor people. And so that category then of leadership and community engagement, especially where you're seeing that resonated in your conversations with people or in the job descriptions, can be valuable. But obviously, it doesn't want to be the same size as your relevant experience. It doesn't want to be bigger than your relevant experience because it's not directly applicable to the role. So you want to shrink it down slightly, really focusing on those skills that are most additive and transferable, frame it as professional leadership and whatever experience that you want, move it to the second page so it's not on the primary page, but also include it because being interesting is also helpful. It's also valuable to be someone who's not just one thing, but who has lots of different interests. So I wouldn't make it go away, and I wouldn't try to sort of distribute it too much. I would own it and say, look, here's my leadership experience, but just deprioritize in terms of the space and refocus the attention on the skills that are transferable. Does that
Thank you very
answer
much.
some of those questions?
Yes.
Shubha, go ahead.
All right, thanks for the talk, Joseph. Couple of things that I would ask your opinion on. Number one is when you have a resume, especially a one page, do you want to lose some of that prime real estate to a summary where you're already like figuring out what to cut out of there to make everything one page? So what are your thoughts on that? And
Yeah, sorry, carry on.
no. Let me go get to the second question after you answer this.
Okay, so it's a great question. It's pretty easy to answer, right? The one page is already a summary of lots of different things. So having a summary on top of a summary doesn't make sense for a one-page version. The summary is really great for two reasons. One is when you have multiple pages to make sure that anything that might be on those other pages is also on the first page. It's also really great when you are switching fields, even on a one-page version where you're like, well, look, my experience doesn't really tie together or make sense. So the summary says, innovative researcher with cross-disciplinary ability to work across, 5 different genres of science, right? That's an easy thing to say up front that makes you make more sense when I read it. But if I didn't have that statement up front, I'd be like, wait a minute, no, what are you doing? And what's this, right? So I think sort of using it strategically on a one page works when you're career switching, as it were, but otherwise a one page should be its own summary and doesn't really need a summary statement.
So is there a cutoff number of pages only under which if you fall, you add a summary?
No, it's really about how you want, whether you feel your narrative is enhanced by the summary statement, right? If you think, oh, this makes sense, I've been researching rare earth elements for the last 20 years, and they want someone to continue to research that, you don't really need a summary that says, I'm an effective rare earth researcher, because it's going to be evident there. But if you want to tie in different themes and draw up skill sets that perhaps aren't apparent from the way that your chronology works, or you want to make sure that they know that you can communicate with clients and stakeholders because that was mentioned, and it's not necessarily the thing that you've done a lot of in the work, then the summary section can do that. So it's going to be role specific and use specific to a certain extent. There's no right or wrong answer. It's really different ways of approaching your narratives.
And I guess like part of this, if not all of it, will already be included in the cover letter itself. So if you are sending a cover letter in with the resume, do you still feel that one should have a summary?
So not everyone will read a cover letter, which is disappointing because they're a great opportunity to tell them something important about you. And we've had recruiter panels where someone basically says, I never read a cover letter, in which case we always think, well, why do you ask for them then? And other people who say, when we get down to our shortlist, it's the only way that we can find the candidates that we want to interview because it gives us the insight. So everything in the cover letter needs to be echoed by something in the resume. Not everything in the resume needs to be covered by something in the cover letter. So the cover letter is going to enhance the skills that you talked about in the resume by adding another layer of you onto that story and giving us sort of more story. So yes, you should reinforce the same narrative across documents, primarily because if they don't read the cover letter and that's where you've done that, then no one will see that in the resume. But also because reinforcing the same concept, but in different ways, not just saying the same thing, makes that message stick. And when you're a hiring manager reading 300 applications, that stickiness of your message is going to be important.
And one quick follow-up to what Eric was talking about actually is, for example, I've also been reviewing applications for the applied physics department at here for the past 3 years. And they're like, I guess this is more a theoretical community in general where like being peppy can really act against you a lot of times. They just like professors or even people reviewing the application might feel that your job, like your credentials should be enough to get you through. You don't need particular personality traits to shine through. And like Eric said, that sometimes it can be exhausting looking at 200 very peppy applications in one day. So when you mentioned that part of the process can be a bit opaque, right, and you don't know who's looking at your application, do you not feel that just taking a more neutral stance and not risking being peppy and getting the boot might be a more pragmatic approach?
Right. So there's never a single approach to this, right? And I think I want to sort of clarify that being energetic looks different for different people, but it's more a sense of movement and progress, right? It's not necessarily pure emotion of I'm so happy to be here. I mean, to be honest, the academic environment doesn't value, in general terms, skills or emotions, right? If you look at a CV and the academic job market, none of those materials are rich with emotion. The CV is not basically a skills document. It doesn't want to know if you can communicate effectively, if you can problem solve, if you can collaborate. Those things aren't valued. What's valued are funding and publications and things like that. So yes, there are certainly career field specific genres of materials. To your other point of, should you take a neutral approach? I think that's a very fine strategic approach. I also think that, from a, let's say, more personal perspective, I want to work in an environment where my ideals and my state of being align with everyone else's, right? I want people to know up front what they're going to get when I'm working there, because that's important to me as someone who works there. Now, not everyone gets to be picky about where they want to go or what that looks like. So, playing the odds and being strategic and being not reserved, but just being content and skill focused, perfectly fine. But for some people, it is important to bring an element of themselves to the role, because that's part of the value that each of us as unique individuals bring to a role, right? We are not just a collection of random skills. We are more than that. So I think you're absolutely fine and right to say that sometimes it's off-putting and sometimes for other people, it'll be energizing, and sometimes it's right, and sometimes it won't be right, and sometimes you do it, and sometimes you don't, right? So this is why being a career advisor is somewhat, you have to get out of jail and say, well, it depends. It depends on what's going on, right? There's no one way of doing it. But I think it's worth a discussion with yourself to a certain extent, right? About, well, what am I putting forward here? Is this really demonstrating what they're looking for? And if I see in a job description that they're looking for someone who works in, who's innovative, creative, and passionate about doing X, then I can be those things. If they say a good sense of humor, I can't be that in a cover letter, and I won't be that in a resume. But in an interview, I'll be as humorous as I can possibly can be. Not purposefully, not like, let me tell you jokes, but I can only be myself in those settings, right? And so, then I resonate with that role. But I'm not going to purposely say in a cover letter, I have a PhD in animal behavior, I've studied chickens. Let me tell you why the chicken crossed the road. Ha! Because that won't work. Because I don't know the answer to that question either.
Thanks.
That's great. I want to actually follow up on that just briefly, because those of you who know me know I have a propensity for the enthusiastic, but that is it's just kind of a personality trait. And I think one thing that I would say is I think should just be true to who you are. I know that I'm not like the expert here, but if you told me that I had to be in a setting where I had to be true neutral and just not react to things, I would be miserable. I would hate every day. So keep in mind that you're applying for a job, you are going to have to show up at it every day. So if you sort of, if you say out there, oh my gosh, I'm so excited and I'm so passionate, but then you show up and you're like, hello, I'm here to do my job, then you're not really being fair to the people who are interacting with you either. Like, keep in mind that what you're projecting is what they're hiring. So if you happen to be somebody like me who happens to have a lot of energy, great, like be that, and just make sure that that's very clearly known. But if you're somebody who's a little more just kind of like, I'm here to do the job and this is who I am and I'm just kind of true neutral, great. I think that that's appropriate too. But I just think that matching who you are with what you are, and just being somebody who's been in a space sometimes where there is that mismatch, it ends up creating a lot of like mental anguish in the day-to-day once you do get the job. If you do have that mismatch between what you feel like you're going to make yourself into, because that's what you promised to make yourself into, or what they thought they were getting, but they get something else. So I don't know, Joseph, if you agree with that, but I just wanted to throw that in.
No, I mean, I think it is important to be true to yourself. I think sometimes your goal is to get a job because you need the job, because it's a step in the right direction, and it may not be the perfect job next, but it takes you closer to that. So there are many sort of decisions to make. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to be authentic to yourself. You have to be truthful. You have to be honest, because not being those things can get you into all sorts of individual and other types of trouble. The goal of the resume and the cover letter, or the CV and the cover letter, is to get you the interview, right? So I think it's okay to a certain extent to play it not safe, but to be focused on making sure that they can see what value you bring. In the interview, they're going to figure out one way or the other, your energy and how that aligns with their energy and those types of things, because that's a very upfront environment to do that. And so there are many tiers in which you can do that. But I think you certainly don't want to have someone read your materials and go, well, I'm obviously not going to interview you now, because then there's no point in writing and spending all the time doing that. So there are some boundaries to stay within. But having read many resumes and materials that are incredibly soul-sucking in terms of, just getting through them and going, wow, that didn't sound, not fun. It didn't sound engaging at all. Making a small change in the language that says, I really enjoyed working on this project because I got to find something totally new, or whatever that is. That language resonates with parts of your brain that are positively, emotionally reinforcing, that make you feel better, right? And so from a neuroscience perspective and a psychology perspective, ensuring that the reader goes, oh, great, internally is never a bad thing. But your point was well made in terms of there's no one way to do it. And I'm not advocating for anyone to do anything that they don't feel comfortable presenting themselves. In fact, my role at Career Services is to help people be that best version of themselves moving forward. And there are many ways to do that.
It's a very interesting discussion. I don't want to take any time from anyone else, but it really, and some of the language that we're using this morning puts me in the mindset of a question that I'm asked, and this is another aspect of our work in the center. So I'm an openly gay man, and I am often asked by students and postdocs who are applying for jobs who might identify as queer, do I include this fellowship from Nogle Step, which is an organization that supports LGBTQ plus people in the sciences? Is this something that will exclude me potentially from getting an interview if I have this on my resume? And my advice to them is to be your authentic self on your resume and to actually include that information if you won that competitive fellowship. And that if an organization or a hiring official decides to screen you out because of the presence, one, you'll never know that of that fellowship, but two, you don't want to work for that organization anyway. So I think the speaking to the authentic self point, this is something that's really important, and that we all have to be our authentic selves in this process of looking for jobs. And for LGBTQ plus people, this is a question that often comes up. I don't know if you have any other comment about that, Joseph, but my advice is to always err on the side of including things like that instead of excluding them.
Yeah, and be proud of those things. Those are great accomplishments, and they, people should be lucky to have you in the role where you can bring those skills and experiences. And obviously the world doesn't work that way. Otherwise, I'd be in space right now doing whatever I want to do. But I think it's important to sort of be in that position. So a similar thing would be, sometimes people in their their leadership experience or their community engagement, they list interactions with religious organizations, and then they're applying for a role where someone might see that and say, well, that's not going to align with what we're doing. So that person certainly has a choice to include it and be very upfront and say, this is who I am, I'm not going to change, to not include it, and potentially move along in the process better because they need the job or want the job. There's a lot of personal perspectives there, but at the end of the day, if you're in that role, it should be a role that is supportive to your professional growth and your wellness, your personal wellness. And we don't all get that, and we don't all get that all the time. But it's something that we should be, prioritizing where we can. So everyone has choices not to or include things. You can't make things up. That's the only thing you can't do. But you cannot include things, or you can include things. but being proud and being confident that those things add value, I think that's important. And it's also a life lesson that, being able to advocate for yourself is something that as a student, we should be taught to do better, right? Throughout Penn, even at Penn, I think, having a focus on how to advocate, how to have difficult conversations, and how to come out saying, look, here's how I can add value, or here's how I can resolve this. I think that's a skill set that any group like this, any group where you're bringing together people with different perspectives, is a wonderful place to sort of build those skill sets to help people do that. It's a lifelong skill to advocate for yourself in different situations.
I have one more question that came through in the chat, so I'm asking on behalf of somebody else. Do you have any advice on at what point do you minimize or decrease your list of references for publications at the end of a resume? Is it better to specify some relevant for the application, or give this comprehensive list of 10, 20, 30, however many? Like, what's the balance between too long and like appropriate?
Well, so if you, having the full list is a visual cue, right? So if it's like a long list, you're like, wow, it's amazing. It will certainly generate that. But if 40% of them aren't in fields or on topics that are relevant, then they're sort of somewhat less impactful. But I think, again, they're still outcomes of work. There are many ways around this, right? Certainly you can have a publication section. You can say selected publications, and then you put out of 30, or 10 out of 30. And so they know you have 30, but you're only giving them 10, and you're giving them the 10 that are most relevant in terms of topics or time or journals or whatever it is that you want to focus on. So that's fine there. Again, in the experience section, you can say published over 14 papers and have that listed there, and then you have selected references or selected publications where you list few of those. I'm the type of person who likes resumes that are full pages, not like two and an eighth page, right? So if you have references and they fill out the rest of the page, then throw them out on the rest of the page so you have a nice full page. That's not advice that's going to help you, but it makes me happy, and I think my happiness is always important in these contexts. So I think the idea of having selected publications out of 30 and then listing the relevant ones makes it very clear what you have without overburdening the reader with stuff that they're really not going to look at, right? I don't know if anyone ever goes through all 30 publications and goes, oh, that's very interesting, right? I think it's a visual cue that goes, great, you've been productive.
Excellent. So we ended up having a really great conversation here. So we just sort of bypassed the other version of these smaller discussions, but I think that this is incredibly valuable, and I'm completely happy with all this conversation. This was very, very helpful. You have such great advice and such a great presence about you. We're really very grateful for your presence here with us this morning and for your energy. So if we can join me in thanking you, that would be wonderful.